12 people, not elected, not subject to recall, not required to consult the public before acting. 12 people who collectively control the price of money for a $28 trillion economy, the largest on earth, affecting the financial well-being, the savings, and the purchasing power of 330 million Americans. And the mechanism through which they exercise this control carries zero direct democratic accountability. They are selected through non-public processes. There is no voter approval. There is no recall mechanism. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is the structural design of the Federal Reserve, an institution that was built deliberately and intentionally to operate at a distance from the elected government. Today, we are going to understand exactly what that design was chosen, how it actually works, and what tools these 12 architects use to shape the economy, and whether the arrangement still makes sense in 2026. This is the engine room of the global economy. Let's look inside. Let me make abstract concrete before we go any further. In 2022, the Federal Reserve executed 11 interest rate hikes across exactly 14 months. Not a single public vote was cast. Not a single member of Congress approved these decisions. The FOMC met, deliberated, and voted internally, and 11 times they raised the price of money. The average American homeowner saw their monthly mortgage payments increased by $800. $800 per month. Not a tax, not a bill passed by Congress, the consequence of a committee decision made in the conference room in Washington. The bond market, the largest, deepest financial market in the human history, experienced its worst drawdown in 200 years, 2 centuries, more devastating than any bond market event in the 2008 crisis, more than anything in the dot-com era, more than anything in the inflationary 1970s. And the impact was universal. Savers suddenly earning 5%, welcome news, but a decision they played no part in making. Credit card users paying maximum APRs, stock investors watching their portfolios reprice violently, all from 12 people, exercising the power their institution was designed to give them. Understanding that institution is what this video is about. To understand why the Federal Reserve exists, you need to understand what America looked like without it. Look at this chart. From 1870s to 1913, the United States economy was subjected to recurring banking panics with remarkable and alarming regularities. These were not minor disruptions. They were fully systematic collapses, bank runs, credit freezes, businesses unable to get access capital, workers losing jobs in waves. 1873, a severe banking collapse that triggered a 5-year depression. The railroad boom had fueled reckless lending. When it ended, banks failed in sequence. 1893, another wave. Bank failures, mass unemployment, a deflation spiral that devastated the farmers and the industrial workers simultaneously. And then 1907, the catalyst. This one was different. Not because it was more severe, though it was, but because of how it ended. The Panic of 1907 was not resolved by the government, it was resolved by the one private citizen, J.P. Morgan. The banker, not the bank, personally organized the rescue of the American financial system. He summoned the most powerful bankers in the New York to his private library. He locked the door, and he essentially forced them, through a combination of persuasion and the implicit threat, of his own withdrawal to pool their resources and stop the collapse. Think about what that means. Stability of the largest economy in the world in 1907 depend on the willingness of the one private individual to act. If the JP Morgan had been unavailable, if he had been less persuasive, if he had simply decided it was not his problem, Congress understood what that meant. The country could not be the one man away from the financial catastrophe. On December 23, 1930, the President Woodrow Wilson signed the Federal Reserve Act. The primary directive was clear: create a central bank to act as a permanent lender of last resort, structurally independent from the short-term political pressure, so that its decision would be governed by the economic necessity rather than the electoral convenience. The tension embedded in the design, independence versus accountability, is one of that has never been fully resolved till now, and in 2026 it is more live than it has been in decades. Now let us look at the structure, because understanding who actually makes this decision requires understanding how the institution is organized. Look at the pyramid. At the base, the foundation, are the 12 regional Federal Reserve banks. You will recognize many of the cities: New York, Chicago, San Francisco, Dallas, Atlanta, these banks from the operational backbone of the system. They supervise commercial banks in their regions, process payments, and conduct economic research. They are important, but they are not where the critical power sits. Move up the pyramid. The middle tier is the broad Move up the pyramid. The middle tier is the Board of Governors, 7 members, based in the Washington, D.C. They are appointed by the President and confirmed by the Senate. Usually, they serve staggered 14-year terms. That is not an accident. 14-year terms specifically designed to insulate governors from political cycles. An individual president can only appoint so many governors. No single administration can capture the board. The chair of the board of governors, the Fed chair, leads this body. This is the position Jerome Powell held, and this is the position Kevin Walsh now holds. But now look at the top of the pyramid, the green apex. This is where the real power concentrates. The Federal Open Market Committee, the FOMC. Here is the composition: 7 Board of Governors plus the New York Fed President, who holds an permanent seat, plus 4 rotating regional bank presidents, total 12 voters. Why is the New York Fed President a permanent member when other regional presidents rotate? Because the New York Fed holds the trading desk. When the FOMC makes a decision, it is the New York Fed that actually implements it. Buying and selling assets in the open market, New York is the where policy becomes reality. That operational role earns a permanent seat at a table. 12 people, meeting 8 times per year, deciding the price of the money for the world's largest economy. This is the FOMC, and that is where the real power sits. Federal Reserve has 2 jobs, exactly 2, enshrined by statute in the Federal Reserve Reform Act of 1977. Look at this scale. On the left, price stability. The Fed is legally required to target approximately 2% annual inflation, measured by the PCE index and monitored through the CPI. Not zero inflation, not 5%, 2%, a level judged to provide enough price predictability for the business to plan while allowing the economy to grow. On the right, maximum unemployment, the Fed is required to pursue the highest level of employment consistent with its other mandate, not a specific unemployment rate. The law does not specify a number, but the maximum sustainable level of Americans working. In a normal economic condition, these two mandates work in harmony. A growing economy creates jobs. A stable inflation environment allows business to hire. A Fed's job is the straightforward nudge rates slightly up or down to keep the balance. But look at the scenario A, the top left box. When inflation surges, as it did in 2022, peaking at 9.1%, the Fed must raise interest rates. Raising rates slows hiring, dampens business investment, and can push the unemployment up. The Fed accepts this. Price stability is prioritized. Employment takes the hit in the short term to prevent inflation from becoming entrenched. Scenario B is the mirror. When unemployment spikes, the Fed cuts rates. Cheaper money fuels growth and hiring, but cutting rates when inflation is elevated can make the inflation problem worse. The trade off runs in the other direction. But now look at the center of the slide, the orange box. The concept that makes both of those scenarios look simple by comparison, the stagflation trap. When inflation is high and the growth is slowly simultaneously, both mandates pull in opposite direction at the same time. There is no clean policy response. Cut rates to support the growth, inflation accelerates, raise rates to fight inflation, you crush an already weakening economy. This scenario was last seen in 1970s, produced a decade of negative real returns in the stock market, 20% interest rates, and years of economic pain before it was resolved. And as this slide notes, it is reemerging in 2026. We will come back to that. Let us talk to the actual mechanism. How does a decision made in a conference room in Washington end up in your mortgage payment? It starts here. Step 1. Federal fund rates. This is the interest rate at which banks lend excess reserve to each other overnight. Banks are required by the regulation to hold a minimum level of reserve on deposit at the Federal Reserve. At the end of each business day, some banks have excess reserve, others have shortfalls. The federal fund rate is what they charge each other to balance those books overnight. The FOMC does not directly set this rate. Technically, it sets a target range, but through its open market operation, it ensures the market rate stays within the target. In practice, the Fed sets the federal fund rate. Step 2. Banks. When the Fed raises the target rate, banks immediately face higher cost on their own overnight borrowing. That cost does not stop at the bank. It flows through instantly and completely to their customers. Three pipes carry this transmission into the real money economy. The consumer pipe. Mortgage rate adjust, particularly the 30-year fixed rate, which follows treasury yields, which follow the federal funds rate. This is how 11 rate hikes become 8 under extra. This is how 11 rate hikes become 800 extra dollars per month for the average homeowner. The corporate pipe, business loan cost shift. When borrowing becomes more expensive, companies reduce investment, they delay expansion, they slow hiring. The federal fund rates decision made in Washington translate into hiring decision made in boardrooms across the country. The credit pipe, auto loan rates reprice, credit card APRs reprice. The consumer who carries a credit card balance sees their effective interest rate increase almost immediately after an FOMC meeting. Read this bottom banner carefully. When the Fed raises the rate overnight, bank pays more to borrow and immediately pass those costs to the consumer. The Fed slows the economy by making money mathematically more expensive. That is not commentary. That is the mechanism. The Fed does not write laws. It does not set prices directly. It simply changes the base cost of capital, and everything else reprices around the change. The most important chart any student of the Federal Reserve can study is this one. 40 years of interest rate history, four distinct eras, each one has a different response to the different crises, each one leaving a different mark on the economy and on the asset markets. Start on the far left, Paul Volcker, 1980. Inflation had peaked at 14.8%. The 1970s had been a decade of economic plan, stagflation, oil shocks, a central bank that had been too differential to the political pressure to do what was necessary. Volcker arrived and did what was necessary. He raised the federal rates 20%, the highest level in the US history. The immediate result was a severe recession in 1981. The unemployment spiked, business failed. It was brutal, but it worked. Inflation collapsed from 14.8% to 3.2%. This credibility of the Federal Reserve is demonstrated willingness to cause short-term pain to achieve long-term price stability was established in that moment. It is it has informed monetary policy ever since. Move forward to the middle of this chart, the ZIRP era, zero interest rate policy. After the 2008 financial crisis, the Fed cut rates to essentially zero and held them there for 7 years, the longest period of near zero rates in American history. The intent was to support an economy that was recovering slowly and unevenly from the worst financial crisis since the Great Depression. The consequence, and this is important, was a structural inflation of asset prices. With money effectively free, capital flooded into stocks, real estate, private equity, and eventually cryptocurrency. The 2010s bull market was not purely the result of economic recovery, it was significantly the result of a Federal Reserve that made the alternative to risk asset holding cash mathematically unattractive. Then the spike 2022. Pandemic era simulates supply chain disruptions, and 7 years of near zero rates combined to produce the fastest rise in inflation in 4 decades, 9.1%. The Fed's response, 0 to 5.25% in 14 months, the fastest tightening cycle in the modern history. And now look at the far right of this chart, the orange 2026 warning. The market implied probability of a new rate hike currently sits at 45%, not a cut, a hike, driven by accelerating inflation from the Iran oil shock and a new Fed chair inheriting an economy that does not offer him a clean path in any direction. This chart tells you where we have been. The 2026 chapter is still being written. The federal funds rate is powerful, but it has a fundamental limitation. You cannot cut a rate below zero in any meaningful way. In 2008, when the crisis hits, the Fed cut to zero immediately, and still the economy did not recover fast enough. A different tool was needed, and that tool is quantitative easing, QE. Think of this diagram as a plumbing system, three tanks connected by pipes. The first tank is the Federal Reserve. When quantitative easing begins, the Fed creates money electronically, it credits its own account. This is not printing cash in a physical sense, it is a ledger entry, but the economic effect is the same. New money enters the system. This money flows through the pipe of the second tank, financial institutions. The Fed uses the newly created money to buy assets directly from the banks and financial institutions, specifically US Treasury bonds and mortgage backed securities. The sellers, the banks, receive cash in return for these assets. The cash then flows through the second pipe to the third tank, the economy and the market. What was happened in the final tank? When the Fed buys treasury bonds at a scale, it drives bond prices up and yields down. Lower treasury yields cascade through the entire rate structure, including the 30-year mortgage rate. Cheaper borrowing makes housing more accessible, stimulates the refinancing, and reduces the hurdle rate of corporate investment. Simultaneously, falling yields makes bonds less attractive relative to equities. Capital rotates into stocks, equity valuation expand, the tank fills. Look at the scale of what happened between 2020 and 2022. The Federal Reserve's balance sheet expanded by $5 trillion, from 4 trillion to 9 trillion in just 24 months. In exchange for that expansion, the S&P 500 doubled from its March 2020 low to end of 2021. This is not a coincidence. It is the mechanism. Now read the bottom of this slide. Quantitative tightening. QT is the reverse. The Fed sells assets back into the market or allows them to mature without reinvestment. Money leaves the system. The tank drains. Asset prices face a structural headwind. The Fed has been running quantitative tightening since mid 2022. It is still running. Every month the balance sheet shrinks. Every month, that liquidity that inflated asset prices over the previous decade drains a little further. This is the second instrument. It is in many ways as powerful as the federal fund rate itself, and it is permanently underappreciated by the retail investor who focus only on the rate decisions while ignoring the balance sheet movements. Here is something that surprises most people when they first encounter it. The Federal Reserve often moves market without doing anything at all. Look at this chart. The top line shows market expectations, how financial markets priced risk throughout 2021. Notice what is annotating that rising line. Inflation is transitory. Inflation is transitory, said 5 times by the same person, the chairman of the Federal Reserve. And each time he said it, market priced it continued easy conditions, more risk taking, higher valuations, and continuation of the bull market. Fed had not raised rates, it had not done anything, it had simply spoken, and the market repriced on the basis of what the Fed said and it was likely to do. This is called the forward guidance. And in financial markets, it is almost as powerful as the actual policy tools themselves. Now look at the bottom line reality. When inflation proved to be not transitory, when it became clear that the Fed had misjudged and that the inflationary impulse was structural rather than temporary, the repricing was violent. Tech stocks collapsed 30 to 70%. The bond market suffered its worst drawdown in the 200 years. And here is the most important detail. This happened before the Fed raised rates even once. The repricing occurred on the basis of the changes expectations. The market repriced what it believed the Fed would do. The actual rate hikes came months later, and by then much of the damage was already done. Read the code inside the box in the center of this chart. Tomorrow expected interest rate matters exactly as much as today's actual rate. Credibility is the Fed's ultimate currency. That is not a philosophical statement. It is the description of how financial markets actually work. If the Fed says it will hold rates steady and the market believes it, long-term borrowing costs stay low. If the market stops believing the Fed, if credibility is damaged, long-term rates rise regardless of what the Fed actually does. This is why the Fed put, that phrase on the right panel, matters so much. The Fed put is the market's long held belief that if the asset prices fall far enough, the Fed will cut rates to rescue them. That belief in itself encourages risk taking. It acts as a floor under markets. Whether the Fed put still exists in a world of persistent inflation is one of the central unresolved questions of this investing cycle. The Federal Reserve was designed to be independent, but independence from what? And at what cost? This is the defining tension of central banking, and it is more acute in 2026 than it has been at any point in the recent memory. Look at the left panel, the case of independence. Elected politicians face re-elections every 2 or 4 or 6 years. Their incentive structure, quite rationally from their perspective, favors policies that produce short-term growth and visible prosperity before an election. Cutting interest rates stimulates the economy. It makes voters feel better. It produces good headlines. The problem is that the long-term consequences of premature rate cuts, embedding inflation, inflating asset bubbles, storing up future pain, do not arrive on a convenient electoral timeline. They arrive years later for a different administration, a different Congress, a different electorate. An independent central bank can do what elected politicians structurally cannot: force short-term recessions to prevent a long-term catastrophe, raise rates before an election if the data demands it, make unpopular decisions on a timeline determined by the economic necessity rather than the electoral convenience. Now, look at the right panel, the case against independence. 12 unelected officials control the wealth of 330 million citizens. Not one of them was chosen by those citizens. Not one of them can be removed by those citizens if they make decisions that citizens consider harmful. When the Fed raises rates and 2 million people lose their jobs, as has happened following aggressive tightening cycle, those people had no vote in the decision. Cost was borne democratically, the decision was not made democratically. That is a legitimate concern. It is not fragile politics, it is a serious institutional question that political philosophers, economists, and the legal scholars have debated since the Fed's founding. But the bottom of this slide provides the most concrete answer we have to what happens when that independence is compromised. The Nixon Burns precedent. President Nixon pursued Fed Chair Arthur Burns to keep interest rates low in the period leading to 1972 election. Burns, to his lasting discredit in the historical record, compiled the short-term results: a strong economy before the election. Nixon won by a landslide. Nixon won by a landslide. The long-term result: inflation became entrenched. In 1970s stagflation that followed a decade of negative real returns, economic stagnations, and eventually the brutal Volcker shock is widely attributed in significant part of the moment of political capitulation. A decade of stagflation for one election. The lesson that institutional economists drew from the precedent was unambiguous: the worst decade of stagflation for one election. The lesson that institutional economists drew from the precedent was unambiguous, and the cost of compromising central bank independence is paid in inflation. And inflation, once unanchored, is extremely difficult and painful to bring back under control. In 2026, with the new Fed chair confirmed in the most divisive Senate vote, is the institution history. That lesson is worth remembering. Everything we have discussed so far concerns the domestic American economy. But Federal Reserve decisions do not stop at the US border, not even close. Look at this diagram. Think of it as a gravitational system. As the center Federal Reserve it raises US interest rate, the first ripple outward, the US dollar. When US rate rises, the return on dollar denominated asset increases. Global investors seeking yield move capital toward those higher returning assets. Demand for dollar rise, the dollar strengthens. And this matters enormously because approximately 60% of global foreign exchange reserves are held in the US dollars, and approximately 50% of international trade is invoiced in dollars. The dollar is not just America's currency, it is the world's reserve currency. When the dollar strengthens, the entire global financial system feels it. The second ring, the dollar debt and the commodity flow. Many countries, particularly developing nations, borrows in US dollar. When the dollar strengthens, the dollar denominated debt becomes more expensive to service in local currency terms. And country that borrowed $1 billion at 5% interest suddenly finds that the local currency cost of that debt has increased by 20 to or 30% without any change in the loan terms. Simultaneously, commodities priced in dollars, oil, metals, agricultural products drop in dollar terms as the currency strength. For commodity exporting nations that depend on those revenues, a dollar surge is an income shock. The outer ring, the casualties. In 2022, when the Fed tightened at the fastest pace in the modern history, capital fled emerging markets towards higher yielding US assets. Currencies weakened, dollar debt costs surged, trade revenues fell. Sri Lanka, sovereign default. The government could not service its debts. Essential imports, fuel, medicine, food become unaffordable. Pakistan required an emergency IMF bailout to prevent a comparable collapse. Argentina, the peso collapsed as capital outflows accelerated an already fragile situation. Egypt, a severe currency crisis that required emergency foreign exchange support. Now, read the key insight at the bottom of this slide. None of these nations caused US inflation, but all bore the consequences of fighting it. That sentence deserved to sit in silence for a moment. Sri Lanka did not cause the post pandemic inflation spike in the United States. Pakistan did not cause it. The families in Cairo who saw their currency collapse did not cause it. But when the Federal Reserve chose to fight that inflation by raising rates aggressively, a decision made entirely in Washington by 12 people for an American audience, the collateral damage was global, and it was borne by the people who had no representation in the FOMC meeting room. This is what it means to the Fed, to the gravitational center of the global financial system. Let us now bring all of this to the present moment because federal movement let us now bring all of this to the present moment because the Federal Reserve in 2026 is not facing a theoretical challenge, it is facing a real one. And based on the framework we have built together in this video, I think you will understand exactly why this moment is so significant. Look at the top left quadrant. Inflation re-accelerating. The April Consumer Price Index is expected at 3.9%, up from 3.3% the prior month, the biggest single month jump in years. The ISM Manufacturing Prices Index has reached 84.6 a 4-year high indicating that cost pressure across the US factories are at their most intense since 2022. The driver, the Iran conflict and its consequence, the Strait of Hormuz closure, pushing oil above $110 per barrel. Energy shocks are not transitory. Petroleum is embedded in the cost of plastics, fertilizers, chemicals, and the transportation of every product in the US economy. This price will flow through the entire supply chain over the coming months. Top right, growth cracking. The real unemployment rate, including discouraged workers and the underemployed, has reached 8.2%. Part-time employment surged by the 444,000 in April, the largest such increase in over a year. This is not a sign of the labor market adding quality jobs, it is a sign of labor market under strain. Consumer sentiment is deteriorating. Bottom left, market reality. The 10-year Treasury yield has hit 4.45%, the highest in a year. The 30-year yield is above 5%, and the market implied probability of a rate hike in 2026, which set at essentially 1% just 2 months ago, has spiked to 41%. The bond market is telling you that it no longer believes that the next Fed move is a cut. It is pricing a meaningful probability of another hike into an already slowing economy. Bottom right, the political context. Kevin Walsh was confirmed as the Federal Reserve Chair in the most divisive Senate vote in the institution's history. 54 to 45, Chairman Powell, his predecessor, does not leave this Fed. He remains on the board of governors with a vote until 2028. The political pressures on Fed independence from both the executive and the legislative branch is at modern highs. Now look at the orange octagon in the center, the stagflation paralysis. High inflation demands rate hikes, slowing growth demand rate cuts. There is no clean exit. That is not a hyperbole. This is an accurate description of the position of the Federal Reserve in the today's. The mandates are in direct conflict. The tool that addresses one problem makes the other worse, and the new chair inheriting this scenario is doing so. In the most politically charged environment the institution has faced in decades, there is no clean exit. Let me close with the 5 pillars. Pillar 1, Origin. The Federal Reserve was born in 1913 from a century of banking panics. It was designed exclusively as the systematic backstop, a lender of last resort, whose existence would prevent the American financial system from ever again depending on the willingness to provide a private individual to save it. Pillar 2, the dual mandate. The eternal trade-off: the Fed is legally required to balance 2% price stability against the maximum employment. When those two mandates align, the Fed's job is manageable. When they conflict, as they do today, there is no clean resolution. Pillar 3, the primary tool. The federal funds rate, an overnight banking mechanism. The rate banks charge each other for overnight reserve that dictates the base cost of all capital. When this rate moves, every mortgage, every corporate loan, every credit card rate, and every quality valuation moves with it. Pillar 4, balance sheet. Quantitative easing and quantitative tightening, the post-2008 machinery that allows the Fed to inject or drain liquidity directly into the financial system when rate policy alone is insufficient. The balance sheet is now permanently one of the most important variables in any investment framework. Investors who ignore it ignore one of the primary drivers of asset prices in the modern era. And pillar 5, credibility. The slide highlights this one in dark blue for a reason. This is the ultimate weapon and the ultimate vulnerability. If the market believes the Fed will do what it says it will do, if its forward guidance is credible, then inflation expectations stay anchored, businesses plan around stable prices, workers do not demand excessive wage increases to compensate for the expected inflation, the whole system functions. But if the market stops believing the Fed, if credibility is damaged, whether by political interference, by misjudgment, by inconsistency between word and actions, then inflation expectations become unanchored, and unanchored inflation expectations are self fulfilling. People expect prices to rise, so they raise their prices, so prices rise, so expectations rise further. The spiral is extraordinarily difficult to stop once it begins. The Volcker shock, 20% interest rates, a severe recession, was the cost of stopping it the last time it happened. The Federal Reserve credibility was not built in a day, it was built over decades of difficult, unpopular decisions. Over the Fed chairs who were willing to cause recession will kill inflation. Over an institution that maintained its independence when political pressure pushed the other direction. Credibility is easier to spend than to rebuild. In 2026, with a new chair confirmed in a deeply divided Senate vote, with political pressure on Fed independence at modern highs, and with a taxation environment that offers no clean policy path, that credibility is being tested. How the Federal Reserve responds to that test will shape asset prices, inflation, employment, and the economic lives of 330 million Americans for years. That is the institution, that is the power. And now you understand both. Signing off. Before we close, if this was useful to you, subscribe. Every Sunday I will publish a deep dive like this one, covering the institution, the history, and the mechanism that actually derive financial market. No noise, no hype, just proper research.